Shalom, shalom, peace, peace. This is Jadiel from the Fourth Angels Learning Center. And today, I want to thank you guys for joining our study today. We're going to be having a discussion. We're going to kind of dive a little bit deep into this. This is referring to the information pertaining to the Feast of Harvest, which many people refer to as Pentecost. And we're going to be covering a lot of information just to make sure that we understand this feast properly. There's a lot of very important things that we need to make sure that we keep in mind when observing this feast. So we want to kind of go into detail with everything that this feast entails, because this feast, most feasts, all the feasts are actually prophetic. They actually reveal the plan that Yah has for his people. Not only the plan, but the things that's going to occur for his people and the things that Messiah will perform in the future, in the near future. So we're going to start with understanding the term Pentecost. Why do people refer to it as Pentecost? Well, Pentecost comes from the Greek word. The Greek word for Pentecost is Pentecoste, and Pentecoste means 50. It means 50th, meaning a 50th place. So that means that there's a count. There's a count, and then the word Pentecost is an emphasis on the 50th count, and we're going to look at that right now. Let's go to Acts chapter 2. Let me share my screen. So Acts chapter 2, looking at what it says right here in verse 1, it says, and when the day of Pentecost was fully come, and I like what this word fully come is referring to. It says to fill completely, to complete entirely. Let's look at the word Pentecost. That word Pentecoste means 50th. So when the 50th day, when the day of the 50th or the 50th day has fully come, meaning that it's referring to the count. So it's not necessarily the name of the feast, but a nickname that they refer to in order to understand that it's the 50th day. It says that they were all in with one accord in one place. And then it says, and suddenly there came a sound from heaven as a rushing mighty wind, and it filled all the house where they were sitting. Let me put that there. And there appeared unto them cloven tongues as a fire, and it sat upon each of them. And they were filled with the set apart spirit, and began to speak with other languages as the Spirit gave them utterance. And I want to focus right here. You see this word holy here? That word holy, I think many people would understand that, especially many people who study Hebrew and things like that, they'll understand that that word holy means separate or set apart. But the interesting thing is that when that spirit comes on you, then you become set apart. There's this separation that occurs. Let me go to it. So that word is hagios. And it means, well, it's not really referring to any specific definition, but the Hebrew word kodesh is an emphasis on being separate. This is a separate spirit. Why is this a separate spirit? Why does it need to be referred to as a separate spirit? Well, the scripture talks about familiar spirits as well, or evil spirits that are located in this world, performing wicked things, darkness in high places and principalities and powers and things like that. So a separate spirit will be something exclusively connected to Yah. And this is very important for us to understand that when the spirit comes upon them, when the set apart spirit comes upon you, you become set apart. This is how you become set apart. What does this have to do with the Feast of Harvest? We're going to continue to look at this. So Pentecost, the term Pentecost is a reference to the 50-day count, and that when Pentecost or the 50th day has fully come, they refer to that day as the 50th day. So it's not a name for the actual feast. It's a nickname for the day that actually came, the 50th day. This feast is also referred to as the Feast of Weeks. So you had Pentecost, and now we're going to look at the term Feast of Weeks. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 16. And it states, 3 times in a year shall all your males appear before Yahuah, your Elohim, in the place which he shall choose, in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, right? Passover unleavened bread, And then it says, in the Feast of Weeks and in the Feast of Tabernacles, and they shall not appear before yahuah empty. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of yahuah Elohim, which he have given you. So, the Feast of Weeks, that word weeks in Hebrew is what many people who keep this feast refer to this feast as. This word is Shabuot. Shabuot. Let's look at that. So Shabuah, Shabuot is the feminine. So the word Shabuah or Shabuot means weeks. It means weeks. See that? Weeks. Oh, sorry, a week. So the word Feast of Weeks is referring to the count, the count of weeks to get to that actual feast. Which we noticed that in Leviticus 23, it gives us that instruction on how to count those weeks. Let's go to Leviticus 23. Look at what it says here. Sorry about that. Look at what it says here. It says, where is it? It says here in verse 16. Let's take this off. It says, the morrow after the seventh Sabbath, it says here in verse 15, you shall count unto you from the day after the Shabbat, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering. We're going to talk about that in a second. You shall count 7 Shabbats shall be complete. Even the day after the seventh Sabbath or Shabbat shall you number 50 days. You shall offer a new meat offering unto yahuah. So you have a 50-day count starting from the wave sheaf, or the day that the first fruits of the harvest was offered up. From that day, you begin your count. That is day 1. And then you count up to day 50. And day 50 is actually going to be the set apart, the holy convocation, the set apart gathering. Very important for us to understand. This is how you count the 50 days. Now, this is why they also refer to it as the Feast of Weeks, because you're counting 7 weeks, 7 Sabbaths. And another meaning for the word Shabbat is not only to rest and to cease, but it also means a week. So it not only means the 7th day, but it also means a week, an entire week, 7 days. So when it says 7 Shabbats, it's referring to 7 weeks. And 7 times 7 is 49. And that's why in verse 16, it says the day after the 7th Shabbat, you shall have 50 days. This is how we count Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks. So we understand that Pentecost is the number 50 in the Greek, and this is the nickname for the feast. It's not really a title that Yah gives this feast. Shavuot is the term based off of the count, the 50 days or the 7 weeks. That's why it's referred to as the Feast of Weeks. We saw this in Deuteronomy 16. Another term, which we just talked about, because the first day is called the day of the wave sheaf, right? The day that you brought the wave sheaf offering in. It's also referred to as the first fruits. It's also referred to as the first fruits. Let's look at that. Exodus chapter 23. No, sorry. Exodus chapter 34, I believe. So let's go to Exodus chapter 34. We're going to look at verse 22 and 23. It says in verse 22, you shall observe the Feast of Weeks. And then it gives you another term, the Feast of Weeks. And then it says of. That means it's the Feast of Weeks, or the Feast of the first fruits of your harvest, of the wheat harvest. And then it says, and the Feast of the Ingathering and the year. That's referring to Sukkot, which is another term. Ingathering is another term for Sukkot. But here it says the Feast of Weeks is also referred to as the Feast of the first fruits of the wheat harvest. The Feast of the first fruits of the wheat harvest. So the Feast of First Fruits is referring to the beginning harvest of the year. So in the spring, there's a harvest. And that harvest goes from the spring to this particular time, which is why it's called the Feast of the First Fruits of the Wheat Harvest. So this would actually begin and end the beginning harvest pertaining to the wheat, the barley, and things like that. So afterwards, you're going to have a continuation of the wheat harvest because it goes throughout the year. But then there's also at the end gathering, there's also another harvesting of the olives, the fruit of the vine, the fruit of the olives, and as well as the wheat. Yes. So this is why the feast is also referred to as the Feast of the First Fruits. The Feast of the First Fruits. Let me bring a little bit of clarity. Let's go to Leviticus chapter 23. Many people think that Feast of First Fruits is the day of first fruits, and I want to kind of clarify this. Even the scripture says the Feast of First Fruits, right? Now, according to the Hebrew, the word feast means appointed time, and there's an accuracy in calling it an appointed time, but it is not a gathering for Yah's people. It is an appointed time in order for the priest to perform an offering, and this offering is referred to as the wave sheaf. Look at what it says, Leviticus chapter 23, starting from verse 10. It says, "Speak unto the children of Israel, and say to them, when you come into the land which I give to you, and you shall reap the harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest unto the priest. He, the priest, shall wave the sheaf before yahuah to be accepted for you. On the day after the Shabbat, the priest shall wave it." So this occurs the day after Shabbat, which is the first day of the week. It says, "You shall offer that day when you wave the sheaf, and an he lamb without blemish of the first year for the burnt offering." So the wave sheaf or the first fruits offering is the wave sheaf, the first fruits of your field, plus a lamb without blemish of the first year. This is going to be the offering of the first fruits. This is what happens on this day. Now, this is the day that you wave the wave sheaf, as verse 11 declares. So when we get to the counting to get to the Feast of Harvest or Shabuot, look at what it says here. In verse 15, it says, "You shall count unto you from the morrow after the Shabbat, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering." So from the wave sheaf, from the day that you brought the wave sheaf, you will count 7 Shabbats right here, 7 Shabbats. And then it says, to the day after the 7th Shabbat, you shall number 50. Now, this will be your first fruits. Look at what it says in verse 17. For the 50th day now, it says, "You shall bring out all the habitations, 2 wave loaves, 2 tenth deals of fine flour. They shall be of fine flour. They shall be baked with leaven." And then it says, "They are the first fruits unto yahuah." So the reason why this feast is referred to as the first fruits is because everything that is harvested or cut from the time of the feast of first, or the day of the first fruit offering, which is day 1 of the 50-day count, all the way to day 50, everything is referred to as first fruits. This is the beginning of your harvest. Okay, so the first fruits of the harvest is a time period from the first month of Yah's calendar all the way to the 3rd month of Yah's calendar. Basically from the beginning of the spring to the summer. So this is why the feast is referred to as the Feast of First Fruits as well. But there's one term that I want to emphasize on, and it's called the Feast of Harvest. Where does it refer to as the Feast of Harvest? Let's go to Exodus chapter 23. Exodus chapter 23, verse 16 and 17. Look at what it says, guys. The Feast of Harvest. And then it says the first fruits of your labors, which is sown in the field. So the Feast of Harvest is the first fruits of your labor as well. Then it talks about the ingathering again, which is Sukkot, which happens at the end of the year, when you gathered in your labors out of the field. So this is also another harvest. So Sukkot is actually the end of another harvest, but the first fruits of the harvest is from the spring to the 50-day count of the Feast of Weeks. So the Feast of Harvest is a term. Now, the word harvest is very important for us to understand, because this is why what occurred in Acts is so important, because the word harvest, the Hebrew word harvest, is the Hebrew word katsir. Let's look at that. Katsir, right? Cuts eared with the cuff. And it means, of course, it's talking about harvesting. And it means to sever. It means to sever. Like how a limb is a branch that is cut. So it means to sever. So what do people do when they harvest? When people harvest, they cut the wheat. They not only cut the wheat, they bundle it up and they separate it from the field. So they cut it, separating it from the field, and they put it to the side. This is a very important term, because we just talked about the set apart spirit pouring out on the apostles. We talked about the set apart spirit. We talked about what makes us set apart is the set apart spirit. So we understand why the Messiah used these terminologies pertaining to the harvest, or being severed or separated from the earth. You are no longer of the earth. You are separated from the earth. So it's very important that we understand the nature of this feast. The feast is supposed to emphasize on the harvest, which is us. Remember, the Messiah said, the harvest is ripe, but the laborers were few. And he was referring to the people. When he looked at the people, he said the harvest was ripe. He referred to the people as a whole as a harvest, but he said the laborers were few. Now, the laborers, what were their job? Their job was to harvest. Their job was to sever the wheat, was to cut and separate the wheat from the earth, bundle it up, and then they would gather it again. They would do another go around, and they would gather all of the bundles into the storehouse, which is emphasis on ingathering in the last end of the year. But we're going to kind of focus on this. So the Feast of Harvest is an emphasis on the separation, the cutting of the wheat. So what is this cutting? This cutting is the separating from us from the world. This is why the pouring out of the Spirit was so important. How does the separation happen? How does this separation happen? The separation happens when the Spirit comes into us, and then there's a difference. We are no longer the same. We are no longer walking the same, talking, thinking, acting. We are now separate. We are now different. Matter of fact, let's look at a few verses talking about that difference and the dramatic difference. Let's go to 2 Corinthians. I believe it's 2 Corinthians. Let me see. Yes. So look at 2 Corinthians. Look at the emphasis when he says in verse 14 in chapter 6 of 2 Corinthians. It says, be not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. It says, for what fellowship have righteousness with unrighteousness? No fellowship, right? What communion does light have with darkness? No communion. What concord does Messiah have with Belial? Belial referring to vain individuals. What part have he have that believe with an unbeliever? What agreement does the temple of Yah have with idols? You are the temple of the living Elohim. As Elohim said, this is verse 16, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their Elohim, and they shall be my people. Look at what it says in verse 17. Wherefore, come out from among them and be ye separate. Come out from among them and be ye separate, saith Yahuwah, and touch not the unclean thing, and then I will receive you and will be a father unto you, and you shall be my sons and daughters, saith Yahuwah Almighty. So the separating or the cutting, the severing is occurring in order to separate us from the world. We are separated in order when we receive his spirit, his set apart spirit sets us apart. And then he tells us, come out from among them. Verse 17, come out from among them. Be separate. When does he say this again? He says this in Revelation 18. Let's check out Revelation 18. Look at what it says here. Here we go. Verse 4. I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, that you be not partakers of her sins, and that you receive not her plagues. For her sins have reached unto heaven, and Yah have remembered her iniquities. So the separation is not only the separation of people from people, is also the separation from the righteous from the unrighteous. Yah's people from sinners. There's a separation here. So why is this so important? How does this manifest in the book of Acts? Acts chapter 2. It says, when the day of Pentecost was fully come, they were all in one accord in one place. Suddenly came the sound of heaven. Remember, we read this in the beginning, a rushing mighty wind, and it filled the house that they were sitting in, and appeared unto them cloven tongues like a fire, and there sat upon each of them. They were all filled with the set apart spirit and began to speak in other languages as the spirit gave them utterance. So there was a separation between them and other people. And the preaching that went on was to call them to also be separate as well. Let me show you what it says. Okay, so check this out. Up here, so as they lifted up their voice and as they started to speak, they started to basically express themselves. And in verse 16, it talks about the prophet Joel. In Acts chapter 2, verse 16, it brings us to Joel chapter 2 or Joel chapter 2. Now, Joel chapter 2 breaks down this whole emphasis here. He says, I will pour my spirit upon all flesh. And then he says, your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. And on my servants and on my handmaidens I will pour out in those days my spirit, and they shall prophesy. So this is an emphasis of what's going on in the last days. This is an emphasis of what people are going to do in the last days. When the spirit comes on them, they're going to prophesy. They're going to speak words from Yah. They're going to emphasize on his word. Not only are they going to emphasize on his word, but they're also going to have visions. They're also going to have dreams from Yah. That's why he separated it here. He says, your daughters shall prophesy, your young men shall see visions, your old men shall dream dreams. But then it says, on my servants and on my handmaids, I will pour out in those days my spirit, and they shall prophesy. And then he talks about the signs of the last days. What I want to point out is what Peter says here in verse 36. It says, therefore, let all the house of Israel know assuredly that Elohim have made this same Yahushua, whom you crucified, both master and Messiah. When they heard this, they were pricked in their hearts and said to Peter and to the rest of the apostles, men and brethren, what shall we do? And Peter said unto them, repent and be immersed, every one of you, in the name of Yahushua Messiah for the removal of sins, and you shall receive the gift of the set-apart spirit. So again, the set-apart spirit being bestowed on people. This is what it meant by Messiah saying the harvest is ripe, is ready to be cut. The harvest is ready to receive the sickle. The sickle is the ruach, the spirit. And the spirit will set them apart. The gift of the spirit will set them apart. So this is very important for us to understand the separation that this spirit does from us and the world. And there's no instance in which we receive this set apart spirit and still remain connected to the world. There's no relating. It's not a matter of relating, because we understand those who receive the spirit of Yah understand sin, because we were delivered from sin. Let's take a couple more verses real quick. Romans chapter 8. Look at what it says. Now remember, the Feast of Harvest is a representation of the harvest being cut and separated. And now we see that on the 50th day, there's this cutting and separating. Matter of fact, from the 1st to the 15th day, there's a constant cutting and separating of the wheat or the harvest to be gathered by the owner of the field. So look at what it says. Look at the separation that exists. The separation that exists. Look at what it says in verse 5. For they that are after the flesh do mind the things of the flesh, they that are after the spirit, the things of the spirit. So we have two elements. Everybody is born of the flesh. Everybody is a part of the flesh until they receive the spirit, and then the spirit separates them from the flesh. Check this out. It says to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Does death and life and peace live together or combine together? How can you be life and death? No, they do not. They do not work together. They are contrary to each other. It says, because the carnal mind is enmity against Yah, for it is not subject to the law of Yah, neither indeed can be. You know what that word? Neither indeed can be means that it is not possible for a person to have a carnal mind and be subject to obedience. They are not unable to obey the law of Yah and be carnally minded. It says in verse 8, so they that are in the flesh cannot please Yah. They cannot please Elohim. But you are not in the flesh. Here's the separation, guys. But in the spirit. What did I say? The set apart spirit sets you apart. The Holy Spirit makes you holy. The set apart spirit sets you apart from the harvest. If so be that the spirit of God or Yah or Elohim dwells in you, now if any man does not have the spirit of Messiah, he does not belong to him. If you do not have the spirit of Messiah, you do not belong to him. Now, what does this mean for us? What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Elohim forbid. How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein? That means that there's a separation from sin. If there's a separation from the flesh, there's a separation from sin. Let's continue to look at this. This is what Peter was preaching in Acts chapter 2. Know ye not that as many of us that were baptized or immersed into Yahushua Messiah were immersed into his death? Therefore, we are buried with him by baptism into death, that like Messiah was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we should walk in the newness of life. Our new life, when receiving the gift of the set apart spirit, is the same, is empowered by the new life that the Son had in his resurrection. That's what it says here. That the like the Messiah was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so also we should also walk in the newness of life. For if we are been planted together in the likeness of his death, we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. It's talking about our current walk. Knowing this, that our old man have been crucified with him, that the body of sin might be destroyed. That, and this is very important, that henceforth, meaning from this point on, We should not serve sin. We should not serve sin. We are separated. The set apart spirit has set us apart from sin. It has set us apart from the flesh. And our old man is verse 6 of Romans 6. It says, our old man is crucified with him. And verse 4, it says, we walk in a newness of life because the raised, resurrected Messiah, his life empowers us to walk in a newness of life. This is a very important concept that we need to understand in regards to the Feast of Harvest, in regards to Pentecost, in regards to these things. This is what our minds is supposed to gravitate towards. This is what we're meditating on in this season. We're meditating on the separation that Yah is performing between his people and the world. This is very important for us to understand. The reason why it's so important is because the separation that Yah has between his people and the world is also in regards to who he is going to gather in for himself, which is what the Feast of Tabernacles is about. What is the harvest? Does Messiah emphasize that the harvest is the people and the gathering of his people? Let's take a look. Matthew chapter 13. Let's hear it from Messiah himself. Let's go to verse 37. Look at what it says. Matthew chapter 13, verse 37. And he answered and said unto him, he that sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed are the children of the kingdom, and the tares are the children of the wicked one. The good seed is the children of the kingdom, and the tares is the children of the wicked one. So the seed grows into wheat, or based off of what choice you make, you determine what you grow into. Yah sow good seed, but the wicked one manifests its tares. Look at what it says in verse 39. The enemy that sowed them is the devil. And look at what it says. The harvest is the end of the world. The reapers are the messengers. It says, therefore the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so shall it be in the end of the world. The Son of Man shall send forth his messengers, they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend and them which do iniquity. And they shall be cast into the furnace of fire, and there shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then shall the righteous shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Who have ears to hear, let him hear. Very important. The harvest is us, the wheat is us, and the tares. We will be separated now, and the tares will be automatically separated as well for the judgment. So it's very important that we understand this separation. So the second video that we're going to be discussing. So if we are the harvest, and the cutting is at the end of the world, what is it that the harvest needs in order to flourish as wheat? What does the harvest need in order to flourish as wheat? And we're going to be discussing that in the next video. What's needed for the harvest is rain. So what's needed for the harvest is rain. And we're going to be discussing the relationship between the harvest and the rain. Because there's a necessity for rain in order for the harvest to actually be ready. So we're going to be discussing those things in the next video, and I hope that you guys join us. Thank you for joining us for this study. And we're going to kind of dive into it a little bit deeper in the next study, and I look forward to you guys joining me at that time. All right, shalom. If you guys want to support us, go to 4alc.com, and you can also support us on Cash App, which is $4ALC bless, BLESS. All right, shalom, everyone. You guys have a blessed day. Shalom, shalom. Thank you guys for joining our study today. I hope that it was edifying. And if you want to support this ministry, you can support us on 4alc.com. And don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube page. Click the like button and the notification bell. I hope to see you guys on the next study. Shalom, guys.